Over 3 decades in radio, not because he was talented, but largely because he didn't want to find a real job. He's looking to see where the next chapter takes him, but before he looks ahead, he looks back and shares stories, thoughts, and a few laughs about an exciting career in radio. This is After the Mic Drop. Stories from beyond the studio with Scott Sexsmith.
Welcome back to After the Mic Drop, coming to you from Studio 3B along the shores of Lake Superior. I'm Scott Sexsmith, and as always, across the glass from producer Paul. Want to say thanks to everyone who reached out following our last episode that focused on heroes and why it's so important to have one. On today's episode, we're going to mix things up just a little bit. I'm very pleased to be joined by two fellas that I had the privilege of working with for almost 20 years. First is our producer of After the Mic Drop, Paul Hayes. Hazy, great to have you on the show.
Hello.
And we're also joined by the intro extra voice of this series, a guy who is no stranger to radio in Northern Ontario, Mr. Scott Turnbull.
It's nice that you call me Mr.
It is. It's nice to be called Mr.
It's the nicest thing you've ever called me. Nice to be here, though.
Guys, before we, first of all, thanks for doing this. I appreciate you taking time out of your very busy schedules. We talked about heroes on the last episode of After the Mic Drop, and I'm curious, you guys know me well enough that you know Wayne Gretzky was mine. I'm curious who yours was.
You want me to start?
Sure, you can start.
I have a few.
Okay.
And they're still my heroes. I think when you have heroes when you're a child, they just stay with you. When I was a little boy, I was either going to be a professional baseball player, football player, or hockey player, depending on the season. So as far as baseball was concerned, Rocky Colavito was playing left field for the Detroit Tigers, and I loved him. To this day, if I could get an autographed baseball somewhere from him, and they're out there, and he's still alive, I'd love to. Football, I was a big Ottawa Rough Riders fan, so it was Russ Jackson and Ron Stewart, quarterback and running back. And hockey, I was a goalie, and I was a Red Wings fan. I thought Terry Sawchuk was the best, and then I saw Roger Crozier play. He replaced Sawchuk in Detroit, and I thought he was amazing. I actually saw him play live in the Old Eastern Pro League when he did play a couple of games in Sault Ste. Marie, and then played for Syracuse Braves and St. Louis Braves. This is the early 60s. I'm going way back. So those guys were my sports heroes. Gordie Howe I can throw in there too. But I think the people that made the biggest difference in my life, and I think I'm here because of them, it's the Beatles. And I'll bet you there's 100 guys, 1,000 people in broadcasting who can do that. When they hit, all of a sudden the music was magic, and I wanted to be part of it. And I was like every second announcer on the air, a failed drummer. But I thought, what can I do to be part of this? And I thought, I can go on the radio. Maybe. It was a pipe dream when it first came up, and it worked out for 43 years. So those are my heroes.
And a couple of thoughts come to mind just listening to you tell that story. First of all, when I first arrived here in Sault Ste. Marie, the first time that I met you, you mentioned that you were a goalie. And before we exchanged pleasantries, the first thing that you said to me on my first day, you screamed down the hall, "Did you bring your hockey equipment?"
Yeah.
That I will never forget. And it's funny you mentioned the Beatles. I know you're a big fan of oldies, and you actually went on to host a syndicated oldies show that ran across Northern Ontario called Solid Gold Saturday Night. And I don't think anybody knows that era of music the way that you do.
Well, there are some, and I still learn things, and Facebook is wonderful, and Google is wonderful, and for that. But I'm still trying to find out things. I've read, especially with the Beatles, I've read dozens of books, and 60s music that's what I think formed my personality. Or the way I am. I don't know.
And some may say you're still stuck back there.
Well, yeah. Well, I still say I'm a child of the 60s, and I remember when the 80s rolled around, I went, holy cow, I'm a child of the 60s and the 70s are gone? I'm getting old. And that was a long time ago.
Yes, aren't we all? Hazy, what about you?
I don't know. I can't follow that. All I can say is growing up, listening to the radio when I was a kid. Scott Turnbull on CKSO 790.
I was your hero, right?
You're my hero.
Yeah, you gotta aim higher, buddy.
Yeah. Well, look at. I'm doing this with you still, all these years later. Yeah. Anyway,
we've all done this a long time. I know I was over 30 years. You are.
I was. I'm actually still doing a little bit of work for Sovereign Broadcasting.
Right.
So it's 43 and counting.
43 and counting, and Hazy, you must be well over 30 years.
32.
Yeah.
Well, plus my college years in between there. I worked in Espanola at a little radio station and. CKNS.
We've been doing this a combined total of over 100 years, the three of us.
Yeah, that's crazy.
Oh my goodness!
Speak up, Sonny.
Holy cow!
And in 100 years, collectively, we've all witnessed an enormous amount of change. Mm-hmm. And I don't want to say you're the elder statesman, but you are been doing it the longest. So 43 years ago, compared to radio today. The change that you've witnessed would be enormous.
Absolutely. I mean, when I started, my first radio station was in Dryden with the Canadian Talent Library, which was a music library that was programmed out of CKEY in Toronto and sent out to various small radio stations who didn't have the resources to have their own music director. So and it was terrible. It was like Johnny Mathis, and then, all these people were great musicians, but they would just, be an instrumental, and they'd be on 45 RPM records, the little ones, or they'd be on albums. And I can't, as you guys can imagine, because you've seen me push buttons, I have no idea how many times I played songs on the wrong speed. Because you had to play turntables. And at one time, I actually went through an entire instrumental, played it on 45, had no idea it was on the wrong speed, and came off the back and said, that was Guido Basso and whatever the heck. And all of a sudden, I looked down, oh, my goodness. I thought, oh, my boss wasn't listening. But then again, my boss wouldn't have known. Nobody called.
No.
But anyway, that's what. So I started with those, and then I went to cartridges. No, which is like it looked like an 8-track.
An 8-track, yeah.
Yeah, and where every commercial and every song was on a cartridge, and it made it a whole lot easier. So you had cart machines, as they used to call them, the control room. So you'd punch the buttons individually. There were smart cart systems there, but that's another story. And so one at a time, and it would just make it easier because you didn't have to queue up records and get it right to the start, so there was no dead air. So that was fun. That was a lot of fun. And then I guess then CDs came along. I reluctantly adjusted to CDs, which was much easier than both the carts and the records. But when it got to computers, I think it's changed radio considerably, mm-hmm. and in a lot of ways, it's ruined radio. That's what it's improved radio on various platforms. It's improved the communication, but I don't think it's done a lot for the actual radio signal and the people on the air. I think it's hurt them.
It's almost taken the personality to a certain extent out of.
Yeah, I mean
the showbiz of it.
Yeah, it's made it easier in that. We live in the Sioux. Markets this size couldn't afford, before computers, I don't think, to keep a full staff for as long as the staff stayed here. Because, we stayed here. I mean, there's a whole bunch of us that have been here for 30 years plus or, close to it. But, in the old days, when you had announcers around the clock, live announcers, I mean, you got somebody doing the all-night show, and they're making $12,000 a year. It's like that's just about as much as you're going to pay for that all-night show. I went through that with in Sudbury one time with CKSO. I was doing what the heck was I doing? 1 to 4, noon to 4, something like that. It was a great shift, or maybe it was 3 to 6. Anyway, I was doing, and I was making. It was a long time ago. Something like $16,000 or $17,000 a year. And it was raise time, and everybody else got their raise. And so I went in and saw my program director, and I said, everybody else got the raise like a couple of weeks ago. I was just wondering where mine went. This is in the late 70s. And he said, I think it was late 70s or something. He said, you know what? He said, you're a good employee. You're a good announcer. But the shift that you're doing doesn't warrant paying too much more. So what I'm trying to do is I'm shifting budgets around to try and get you a little bit of a raise because I like you and I want you to stay. But your shift's not really worth any more than what we're paying you. So shortly after that I wandered off. I mean, I was back, but I wandered off to another radio station where they would pay me a little bit more. But it was just funny. But with computers, you can bring in shows from Southern Ontario, from out west, from the States, whatever you want, and they're virtually live, and they cut down on what it costs to run a radio station.
Sure, and big corporate will tell you that it's more cost efficient and would be able to give a radio station in a smaller market a much bigger sound that they otherwise wouldn't be able to afford.
Yeah, that's one of the things that I do notice about the radio stations, smaller radio stations, is they do sound good. I mean, the announcers now, a lot of them are inexperienced, or not all of them, but some of them are inexperienced, and that's a small town thing. You get a few people with experience, and then people learning. Not as many spots to learn anymore either, but yeah, it does give it a bigger city sound.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Guys, I'm going to cut you off here. We've run out of time, but I'd really dig it if you came back for the next episode and we can pick up this conversation exactly where we left off. Don't forget, all episodes of After the Mic Drop can be found online at afterthemicdrop.com. You can also follow me on Twitter and Instagram at GolfHack99. As always, we leave you with a famed sign-off from a broadcasting legend, and this time around, it's the former anchor of the CTV National News, Lloyd Robertson. And that's the kind of day it's been.
You've been listening to After the Mic Drop, stories from beyond the studio with Scott Sexsmith. Follow Scott on Twitter at GolfHack99. Subscribe to his YouTube channel or reach him by email at scottsexsmith@shaw.ca. Be sure to include your questions, comments, or thoughts about the show. Thank you for listening.